There's an African proverb that says, "Until the lion tells his story, the story told of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." And that shows how powerful story is. The story has the ability to control how people see you because of how it's told. I grew up in Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that country is filled with a lot of things that goes on. A lot of the stories that are told of that country are stories of poverty. I remember growing up in the country and not having much to eat. There were days where we would sit around the fire and our grandmother would tell us stories about powerful African women that were able to change the world because of education. So I believed in the power of education because of my grandmother. But there were also stories told in the country. Stories of women that stayed in abusive homes because of this concept that we call kangamotema. Kangamotema loosely translates to closed heart, but the concept can be translated as endure the pain silently. And this is a phrase that was always told to women in broken homes and abusive homes, to stay in there and endure, because one day that man will change. So there's a lot of women that stayed in those broken homes and were killed, because if they left out in the world, they were told, you can't. Marriage is your definition. So they stayed in those homes until death became their sentence. So I grew up with my grandmother telling me stories about how powerful African women were able to change their world because of stories. You see, the power of story is that stories are able to capture worlds. Stories are able to transport you into realms that you didn't even know that you can go into. Stories are able to make you understand how the world operates. I believe that if a person wants to destroy you, they first start by destroying your story. They start by destroying how people view you. And we see it a lot. I wrote a book, and that book was called Kangamotema. And it was a story about this young girl. Her name is Fura. Fura grew up in an impoverished home and saw her auntie stay in an abusive marriage. Her auntie was told that she couldn't amount to anything. The only thing that she was able to do was produce children. So she stayed at home producing children until her last pregnancy, where her husband beat her to death. And that's the story of a lot of women in my country. They endure abuse. They endure many things because of the stories told to them. But I was able to become the first person to graduate from college here in the United States because of the story. Because of the story that my grandmother told me. She told me I could become something. And she gave me the stories of women that became something, and I believed it. That's the power of a story. I often wonder, many atrocities have happened in the world. What propelled them? There's that political side that propels movements. Let's say the Holocaust. Let's say the Rwandan genocide. Or in my case, the silent Holocaust of Congo that claimed the lives of 10 million Congolese in colonial times in the hands of Belgium. The story that was being told of Congolese were they were barbaric. They were uneducated. They couldn't do anything for themselves. So Belgium justified their cruel actions because of the story that they were telling of the Congolese people. And we see it in this country as well. When we look at our brothers and sisters of African descent, African Americans, the treatment that's given to them, we see that it stems from the story that people have created about them that they believe. A story is that powerful. It can build a nation in the right hands, but it can also break down people in the wrong hands. And we've all been there. We've all heard gossip about people that have said things to you about a specific person. Sometimes we've heard stories about them. And because of those stories, we begin to see them in a different light. We think, oh, this person may be cruel. Because someone constructed this idea of what they think they are, and they fed you, and you believe it. That's how destructive a story is. But in the right hands, it's powerful. We all have stories to tell. And my story got me through college. When I was broken down in my college room, and I wanted to give up, it was the stories that my father was telling me that you can do it. Remember where you come from. I always have a saying that says, I come as one, but I stand as 1,000. So I represent the stories of people that went before me and paved the way. So when I was in college, in my room, crying, at times depressed, there were times I would remember the stories of my grandmother. How she had 14 kids, but she was still able to manage all of that. We all have that story to tell. My story sustained me. But there were stories I was hearing in the country of women that were raped all the time. The UN concluded at some point in the early 2000s that around 48 women were raped in the country every single day, in my country, Congo. But I think it was more than that. I think there were more women that were raped because they just took data from a specific region. And through my nonprofit, when I was talking to these women, some of the women in the country, I realized that the story told of them is that of despair. They didn't know who they were. The story told of them was, this is it. We are only called to produce children. There's nothing more. So we worked on their story. We started working on reorganizing their minds so that they understand that they are more than what they're told. I always say that if you want to control a people, control how people view them. Control their story. If a person tells your story, they have power over you. Now, the other day I was looking at Woman King, and there was a phrase that the king of the Dahomey people said, which was, if you are to keep people bound, you must first convince them that they need to be bound. And that's a power in the words that you say and in the story that you tell. Stories are powerful. Stories are able to bring people together, but they're also able to create separation between people. Stories are able to bring people to understand you, but they can also be cause to divide people. And we see this. You can create a preconceived notion about someone based on what you've heard. But if you go to that person and you know what they say, and you know who they are, and they tell you who they are, you have a better sense of who they are than what you would get from another person. So I believe that stories is our backbone. I believe that stories were used in previous times to control people. A story is a weapon, and we must understand that in the wrong hands it can destroy. Like I said before, we've seen it in the Holocaust. And we've also seen people falling in love with each other because of the stories and because of communicating. So that's the power of stories. When we all come together and tell the stories that represent who we are able to authentically connect with people. And we're able to break off those bridges that are there. Imagine if we had a world where everyone opened themselves up to understand people, despite all the assumptions that they might have heard about a specific person. I always think this. When my little brother goes out, he's a black man in America. When my little brother goes out, I'm always afraid because there's already a narrative created of him. He's a pretty tall man. That's the power of story. He who tells your story controls your narrative. But the moment that you take control of your story and you tell your story, that changes. It changes the game. You are able to connect. You are able to love. And unfortunately, some are able to hate because of a story. So that's how powerful it is. It is so powerful. Stories are the bridge of life. And I always say this, which I'm going to leave you with. Stories are a weapon of destruction, but they're also a nation builder, depending on who tells it. Thank you.